I am a political theorist who, when I'm with other political theorists, pretends to be empirically qualified in various ways that they can't spot whether I am or not. And when I'm with other people, then I get all philosophical in an attempt to appear different from them. This being an interdisciplinary topic, which is obesity, I actually know that there's masses and masses of stuff I don't know. I think there's a lot of stuff that no one knows, but there's a lot of stuff in particular that I particularly don't know. So since there's some people here who may know more about bits than me, that may be relevant, I look forward to this in the kind of questions section. Okay. So also I've given you a long handout and I've put a little note at the top. This is really particularly for me to stop rambling off and stick to the point so that we get through it in a reasonable amount of time. And I mean reasonable by your standards and not just mine. Okay, so this is a talk on being fat and whether it's good or bad for you. But more specifically, it's about whether policies that try to reduce obesity are going to end up benefiting the people that they're aimed at. And what I have in mind here, and all I have in mind here, are policies that try to reduce obesity by making stuff either impossible to get or more expensive or otherwise harder to get hold of. So expensive in money, expensive in time, expensive in being a nuisance, and so on. Such as taxing sugar, that raises a price, taxing fats in food, that raises a price, trying to regulate portion size, such as the one that was eventually abandoned in New York City to say you can't buy sugary drinks or soft drinks in anything larger than this size container. There's sometimes attempts to regulate fast food outlets and reduce their density and so forth. Those are the kind of things I have in mind, not policies such as subsidizing healthy fruit or dropping GST on what's supposed to be healthy. Ones that make things more expensive, harder to get, not less expensive or easier to get. And what I'm interested in is whether these things that are going to raise costs for people are going to make them better off. And I'm particularly interested in a view from mainstream economics which would say, no, this could not happen, or at least this would not happen. If you just make people's choices worse, you make their options worse, then all you're going to do is make them worse off than they would otherwise be. If this conclusion were correct, it would be a very important conclusion. So we political theorists who are interested in trying to help people from making cock-ups with their own lives usually think about the value of autonomy. Do people have a right to go to hell in their own way? And that raises a problem, which is, well, what about on the one hand the value of autonomy as against people's interests? But on this kind of conclusion, if these policies actually turn out to be bad for people, we don't even need to get on to the question about the importance of autonomy. If these policies are bad for their targets and they're designed to help those people and they fail, then there's nothing more to be said. Now, what I'm going to say is that the mainstream economics view is not plausible of everybody, that there really are some people who could benefit by having their options reduced. But I will claim that they are a minority of people. Hang on a sec, I'm just going to go and give a handout to Monique. They are unobtrusively come in your yellow jumper. All right, so here's a bit more throat clearing. I'm only talking about adults and not children. I'm only talking about the effects on people who are the targets of the policy. So, for instance, the point of trying to make soft drinks harder for you to get is to stop you drinking soft drinks for your benefit. I'm not considering what economists call externalities, which in this case might be that people who are too fat cost the health system too much and costs get dumped on others. Leave that to one side. I also want to acknowledge that it's a matter of controversy whether obesity is actually bad for people. That is to say, there's controversy about whether it's the things that appear to be correlated with obesity, such as dying, are actually being caused by that, or whether something else is going on that causes obesity and separately causes these bad effects. And also the size of these effects are also matters of controversy as well, how bad it is if these effects really occur. I also want to acknowledge that the word obese is a loaded word, and that many people, well, many people, enough people think this is a bad word and want to reclaim the word fat instead, because they think obese carries medical connotations that don't belong there. I'm happy to acknowledge that, and I can understand that. And I do want to point out that when I've taught this kind of subjects in the past to thin students who are young, they tend to have a view of people who are obese as people who are stuck in their beds, unable to move. And that's why, for those of you who saw the picture that was at the head of my little talk thing, I wanted to show that it ain't necessarily so. So that was a picture of Vasily Alexeyev, who was a Soviet weightlifter who broke the world record 80 times, thanks to the fact the Soviets gave him a huge pile of money every time he did it, so he did it by 1 kilo each time. And the double gold medalist weighed 160 kilos. That was his body weight, was 160 kilos. And if you looked at the picture, you would see he was not thin, but he was active and was not confined to a bed. Okay. Also, one thing I want to say is that when I'm going to claim most people are going to be probably worse off as a result of these policies, I'm going to totally ignore distribution, just look at aggregate welfare. And I also finally want to assume that the policies, the anti-obesity policies, would actually do what they're supposed to do. So that if you had a sugar tax, it really would reduce consumption. That really would cause people to be thinner. And the question is that better for them? But you can ask many prior questions like, would these policies actually make a difference? Would they actually backfire in some kind of way? Would they be like the dog's breakfast Danish fat tax that got introduced in something like 2012 and repealed a year later as a total policy disaster, and so on? Put that to one side. Okay. So here is the mainstream economics challenge. People are rational and they make well-informed choices. If you give them more options, they are more likely to get what it is that they want. If you give them fewer options, or make those options more expensive, they are less likely to get what they want and they will be worse off. By rational here, the economist means they act so as to maximize the satisfaction of their preferences. In other words, they work out what they want and they act so as to get what they want more. That is all. That is all the economics view of rationality amounts to, at least all that we need to know for this kind of talk. There's nothing else more dramatic in it than that. And the well-informed idea is that they know what they're doing when they do this. So they actually know what these options are that they're choosing from and what their effects are going to be. And on this kind of view, you would say there is no need to worsen their options by, say, whacking up a tax on sugar or banning fast food. If they wanted to have healthy stuff, they would have done it anyway. If they did it, they must have been getting something out of it. And if you stop them doing what it is they wanted to do, you will make them worse off. Now, this kind of view partly has a kind of explanatory function. So in economics, it's partly supposed to explain why people do what they do. And in this respect, it's got a lot of advantages in debates over what it is that's causing obesity. Because, as you probably know, obesity has gone up considerably in the last 40 years or so. It's controversial by how much, but I don't think there's any serious dispute that it's gone up. And although clearly the causes of obesity in some sense are partly genetic, no one's genes, or maybe nobody, but probably nobody's genes have changed that fast over the last 40 years that it's going to be a genetic explanation. The explanation is going to be environmental, and the obvious environmental explanation is a change in relative prices. The kind of food that seems to lend itself to weight gain has just got a lot cheaper in real terms in the last 40 years or so, for reasons of technological change and easier processing, storage, and so on. And this kind of explanation is a classic economics explanation. Why has the consumption of these things gone up? Because the price has gone down. And crucially, you would not then make people better off by putting the price back up again. You'd just be worsening their options, and that's all. So this is the challenge. They must have been getting something out of it, otherwise they wouldn't do it. On what grounds can we say, when people are, say, drinking soft drinks, sugary soft drinks, or eating too many burgers, or not exercising as much as would be necessary to make them thinner. On what grounds can we say, you got it wrong? You're acting against your own interests. They did what they wanted to do. Now, for kind of colleagues in public health, the answer is kind of really obvious. It's bad for their health. That's all. It's bad for their health, and so it must be bad for them. But this is just clearly a mistake. Health is important for sure, but health isn't everything in life. And it's not irrational or unreasonable to trade off health against other good kinds of things. We do this all the time when we take discretionary car journeys, discretionary flights, and so forth. So we kind of run these risks, and there's nothing irrational about this. So here's a kind of nice example. Suppose that you've got a single mother who's trying to hold down 2 jobs in order to feed her family, and she comes home from work completely knackered, and she's got a choice. She can either cook up something full of lentils and carrots that's going to take ages for her kid and not spend time with her kid, and the kid won't particularly like it, or she can give some quick, easy, cheap food now the kid will like and spend more time. It's not irrational, or indeed obviously in any way wrong, to go for the quick, easy option than the lot more complicated but healthier kind of option. So we can't say people are worse off in their welfare terms. We can't say they're worse off just because they're doing what makes them get fatter, because that's unhealthy. Health is not enough. We have to say more. And that's what economists allow for. Economists say, look, people trade these things off. That's what that is. They work out their preferences across all these things, and they act so as to achieve their greatest preference satisfaction. And if that involves sometimes giving up health, who's to say that's wrong? This view then, this economics view, we can break down into the following kinds of questions. Is it really true that people's choices are well informed? Is it really true that if they make rational choices, these choices will be in their interest, will promote their welfare? And then third question is it really true that people make rational choices, or are they irrational, acting contrary to reason when they do what it is that makes them fatter? And I'll go through these questions. Okay, our choice is well informed. I'm going to be very brief here. So I'm going to report what my sense is about the writings on obesity by people who work in this area, and then also dogmatically assert a few things. So my sense is that most people who write on obesity no longer think of obesity as being an information problem. There was the idea that if we give people information, that's all they need to know. They need to know about their 5 a day. They need to know that you shouldn't have all the sugary stuff, it's bad for teeth and so forth. You give them the information, they'll change their behavior. Probably that has happened to some degree. It's very striking in the case of smoking, for instance, that smoking rates went down dramatically simply after people told it was unhealthy, long before there were marketing restrictions or taxes being raised on it. But that's claimed to run its course. More information doesn't really make a difference. When there's been various natural experiments, for instance, some parts of New York City introduced mandatory calorie labeling. You could see what happened before and after, the number of calories people consumed in restaurants, no real difference at all. And indeed, there's something implausible about thinking that if obesity is a problem, if it's a problem, then it's an information problem. And that is, on the whole, we know what it is that causes our weight to go up. I mean, we might not know in any particular given occasion. We might not realize how many calories there are in a glass of wine, or how many calories there are in a piece of cake. And we all know that some unhealthy stuff gets marketed as healthy and so on. But it's not like these are kind of one-off choices. Now you've eaten this cake, that's it, you're just there forever. Yeah, we know these are kind of repeated sorts of things, and we know the kind of stuff we need to do, more or less, if we want to avoid putting on weight. And it's some function of calories and exercise and so on. I mean, it's all more complicated than that, but it's not that much more complicated than that. So for those reasons, I don't think information is a problem here, really, for obesity. If we think there's something going wrong with people getting fatter such that the state should intervene by burdening them with taxes and so on. It's not on the grounds that they don't have the right kind of information. And if it were, then the answer would be give them information instead of taxing them or regulating it out. So the next question then is it really true that rational choices are going to make people better off? I think it's fair to say that a lot of economists just assume that this is so. But in fact, it's clearly not true that rational choices necessarily promote welfare. Part of the answer depends on a further question, which is, what do we mean by welfare? What do we mean by what's sometimes taken synonymously as well-being? So philosophically, there's, broadly speaking, a distinction between objective and subjective accounts of what well-being is. Accounts of what it is that makes people better off. So the subjective view says, more or less, do people get what it is that they want? That's subjective. The objective view says, do people get what they ought to want? Maybe whether they do or whether they don't. If you think well-being is objective, and actually I think it's much more defensible kind of claim that I'm giving an impression of here. If you think well-being is objective, then it's obvious how there can be a gap between a rational preference satisfying choice on the one hand and a welfare improving one on the other. Maybe your preferences that you act so as to maximize are in fact the wrong preferences on an objective view. Hume said, the Scottish philosopher Hume said, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." He didn't think it was irrational. If that's your preferences, then the only rationality question is, do you go about trying to secure the destruction of the whole world rather than the scratching of your finger? But if you're an objectivist, you'll think, no, your preferences were wrong. You shouldn't prefer that. But even on a subjective view, even on a view that says well-being is more or less getting what it is that you want, even then there can be a gap between rational choice and well-being. Let me just give you a brief account of some of these gaps. One is, which is I think completely irrelevant to obesity, is one can be rationally self-sacrificing. So if you have altruistic preferences, you can act on them, be rational, but make yourself worse off. Can't see what this has to do with obesity, so ignore that. Perhaps more importantly, though, is to think about what obesity is if it's a decision problem. Obesity is the result of countless decisions. It's never the result of any single decision. Not only that, it takes a long time to get like this. It's not kind of instantaneous, like irrationally crossing the road and getting hit by a bus. Not only that, if there are bad health effects, they're also not instantaneous, certainly not the serious ones. Not only that, if there are going to be bad health effects, it's a matter of probability and not a matter of certainty. So as a decision problem, one has to decide, should I go for this thing that I like now, even though it may contribute to some kind of obesity, that may, in the distant future, lead to some bad health effect that I don't want. So there's time and probability involved. You could rationally gamble and lose. So you could rationally think, sure, it's worth taking this risk, and then you turn out to be one of the unfortunate people who get excessively hirsute. The claim that being this excessively hairy is somehow linked to obesity. So, but it's rare. Maybe you'd be the person who thinks, I like this cake, I don't want to be hirsute, but it could happen, and you gamble and then you lose. That was a rational choice that turned out to be against your interests. Or you could be a rational discounter and think, it's so far in the future, I care about it, but just not as much as now. That could be rational and yet still be against your interests over the course of a life. So that's another potential gap. And a third potential gap is that there may be some collective action problems going on with rational choice. So it might be individually rational to drive, for instance, because there's no decent public transport around that you'd have to walk to that might make you thinner. So a lot of people who work in obesity think the problem is literally the built environment. Changing the built environment is something that's very hard for individuals to do. So you could individually rationally do something that turns out to be collectively worse for everybody. in which case you can see how government may have a role there in trying to shape the built environment. I don't think this has got very much to do with the tax and regulation policies I'm talking about, though. So I'm just going to say, I mention these things partly because I'm a train spotting completist. I mention these potential gaps. We cannot assume that a rational choice is a welfare promoting choice. And I leave this as something that we could pursue if we felt we wanted to in discussion, but I don't think there's going to be a lot here that is a problem for the economist's conclusion, which is if you put up the costs of people's options by taxing, regulating and so on, you will make them worse off. I don't think there's going to be, in the end, a real problem there. Where the real action comes in is on my third question, which was, is it really true that people make rational choices? So remember, the economist view says people rationally act so as to maximize the satisfaction of their preferences. If they're well informed, they know what they're getting, they pick these things, they make themselves better off. That assumes that they really do act so as to maximize the satisfaction of their preferences, but maybe they don't. Maybe they're irrational. There is what looks like very good evidence for widespread irrationality in the domain of things that cause you to get fatter. So, for instance, people diet. I don't know anybody who likes dieting. I mean, it depends on what you mean by diet, okay? I mean, some people might like paleo stuff where they eat salmon and rats. But I mean, by dieting in the sense of weight loss diet, it's just miserable. It's a miserable experience. People wouldn't go through it unless they felt they were getting something out of it. But one way to think of what's going on here is they are putting up with this misery to try to undo their own previous decisions. They've got themselves in a state where, from their own point of view, they think they're now too fat and they want to lose this weight and pay a big price in misery. Plenty of people also pay a big price in literal money. They go and buy expensive meal replacements. They go and join gyms and bob up and down on funny imaginary steps and so on, like some 19th century convict on a treadmill. They hire people who will shout at them until they've counted up to 10 with their reps on funny bars, and so on and so forth. So what you've got here is evidence that people are trying to undo their own previous decisions. And this is evidence that they have not been, over all this time, just simply cheerfully maximizing the satisfaction of their preferences. That they themselves think something has gone wrong with their decision making. Now, there's lots of different ways in which you can try and analyze the irrationality or the alleged irrationality that's going on here. So here's probably the most common way. It says something like this: remember that obesity is a problem of choice over time. It's not that if you choose now to eat the cake, you get the result now, which is that you get noticeably larger. The problem is that the benefits of abstaining from cake are heavily delayed, but the benefits are immediate. People are biased towards good things now. I want you to notice the way in which I put this. I didn't say people want benefits that are earlier rather than later. A lot of people, and there's evidence for this, so I'm not just kind of speculating at random. A lot of people, if they were offered a choice between in a diet, a meal option that, say, the university's laying on for a departmental seminar or something, what kind of food would you want to eat when we hold this seminar in September? People will pick the kind of fruit and whole grain bread, and they'll leave out the cakes and so on and so forth. And a way of thinking about that is they are perfectly willing to say, well, look, when it's that far off, yes, I prefer short-run cost, which is to forego cake, for longer-run benefit, which is to stay thinner. It's when you give them a cake now that they suddenly switch over and go for the benefit. Not because it's earlier. September is earlier than December 2048 or whenever the bad things are supposed to happen. It's because you get the benefit now. And that's what skews things. And then people take these things, earlier they think they shouldn't do it, and then at the time comes and they change their mind and do it, and later on they wish they hadn't done it. That's supposed to be the kind of classic sort of irrationality. Okay. This way of putting the argument introduces one tremendously, I think, tremendously important idea, which is it allows us to say that if it were true that people are making these kind of biased decisions, that people are acting to make themselves worse off as judged by their own actual preferences. Their own actual preferences at a different time from the exact time at which they act, but nonetheless as judged by their own actual preferences. I think this is very important, and I want to show its importance by giving you a sense of what the problems are with the alternatives. So stand back again. Okay, what's happened? Over the last 40 years, people have got fatter. Are they worse off for being fatter than if they hadn't got fatter? Worse off as judged by what? What is the criterion for their welfare? Suppose you went for an objective criterion. Remember I said there's objective theories of well-being. And you said what it is that makes a life go well is independent of people's own desires or preferences. Then I can't see any reason for thinking you can just say people are worse off for being fatter. They might be less healthy, maybe not, but they might be. They might be less healthy. But health is only one thing. There is no plausible view I can see which says, in general, if you are fatter rather than thinner, and we ignore your financial situation, the time pressures you're under, anything else you care about in your life, if we ignore that and you're fatter, you must be worse off. I can see no grounds for thinking this whatsoever. Now, as it happens, people who write on obesity almost never put their arguments in this kind of term. I mean, for all I know, there may exist public health writers, for instance, who are objectivists about welfare, but my guess is probably not. Instead, you get arguments, and I guess many of these will be familiar to you, that go like this. If the idea is, the economist idea is people make rational choices, the response goes, no, 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 something's going wrong here, such as people are buying these things because of masses of money spent on marketing. People are eating these things because all sorts of ingredients are used which are either addictive or semi-addictive, like sugar, fat and salt, preferably all mixed together. Or people, when they eat things, are mindless eaters. You know, there's plenty of psychology experiments demonstrating that people just, often don't notice what they're consuming. And if you change their plate size or their container size, they will consume much, much more if you up the size than if you have a lower size, but they don't even realize they've done it. So they're not kind of thinking it. And then, of course, also the idea that people are often conflicted and torn and filled with guilt about what they eat as well. Now, if we take these ideas, we think, okay, how do these connect up to the question, would people be better off if they were made to be thinner by tax? Now, one way you can take it is to say people's preferences have gone wrong, they want the wrong thing. Another way to take it is there's nothing wrong with people's preferences, but something gets in between what their preferences are and how they end up acting. If you take the first view, the one that says something's gone wrong with people's preferences, they've been stuck in their heads by marketing or something like that, something's gone wrong with people's preferences, then I think we still have an indeterminacy, which, like the one with the objectivity one, which said, how do you know that these things are going to be good or bad for people? So suppose it's true that people want to eat junk food because of marketing. It doesn't mean that if there weren't marketing, they also wouldn't want to eat this kind of stuff. How are we supposed, on what grounds are we supposed to be able to say, no, you've got it wrong, you've made a mistake? Something may have gone wrong with that preference, but we still don't know what they would have done, what they would actually have preferred if they were well-informed and so on. It may be exactly the same kind of thing. So we can't conclude that they're making themselves worse off. The alternative way to take the kind of all this stuff about addiction and marketing and so on to say something's getting in between what you really prefer on the one hand and how you act. So in other words, we're back to actual preferences again. We're saying, no, you actually prefer to be healthy, but in some way you're not ending up doing the thing that promotes your preferences. So we're back to actual preferences. And I want to say actual preferences is the right way to go here. That if we're going to say people are better off or worse off for being thinner, we need to ask what it is they actually want. Now there's a problem. The problem is this. When I was talking to you about dieting and so forth, I was talking to you about people trying to undo their previous preferences. They wanted something earlier, now they want something different. And in the kind of classic cake example, it goes, you want not to eat the cake appears, you eat the cake, so different preference, and then later on you regret it. You've got preferences that shift over time. You have an inconsistency of preference. But why think that the preference to be healthy is the right one? Why isn't the preference to be unhealthy the right one? If I tell you that you've got beliefs that are inconsistent and I'm right, that doesn't tell you which of your beliefs is the right belief. That just tells you one of them is wrong and maybe both of them are wrong. Just because preferences are inconsistent doesn't mean we can decide, oh, this is the right one and that was the wrong one. Let me give you an example to try to make this point. This is adapted from a guy called Walter Mischel, who's a great writer on self-control, did a marshmallow test, that kind of thing. And he thinks about a colleague who is asked to go and give a lecture in an interesting foreign country in 2 years' time. She agrees. Then the time comes and she bitterly regrets it. Now she's got to have vaccinations and go through all these visa hassles and she's so busy and this, that and the other. But later on she's gone and now she's pleased she went. I can see no reason to believe on the basis of this story that it was the before and after self that got it right. I think the before and after self, the one that said, oh yeah, sure, and oh yeah, I was pleased, is just not paying attention to what a pain it was at the time of actually doing it. Just like we forget, you don't care so much about pain in the dentist chair after it's finished. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. So there's a general problem here about kind of the taking sides. So if you know there's inconsistent preferences, how do we know which is the right side? Okay, let me draw, because I know time gets on, let me draw together and bring in the pseudo-empirical stuff I've done. So what we're going to need, if we want to say that people are acting irrationally, they are acting against what they actually prefer, they actually prefer to be thinner than fatter, and if we were to limit their choices, we would get them to do what it is they actually prefer, have water instead of Coke. If we want to say this, we need to know what is it people actually prefer. I will be very interested to know what your thoughts are on this and indeed how I've done this. I have looked, but I'm not very good at looking, but I have looked and I find very little that's explicitly focused on the question, would the restriction of people's choices actually make them better off as judged by their own preferences or their happiness? There is stuff for smoking, but not that I've come across for obesity. So the proxy I'm going to take is how many people are actually really trying to lose weight? And there's survey evidence of this from Gallup and from the US National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey from a few years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, asking people whether they're trying to lose weight. They do ask them, do you want to be thinner? And a lot of people want to be thinner. 49% in one, 60-something in the other. That is a completely irrelevant question from the point of view of an economist. It's like saying, do you want a tennis court? Sure. What you need to know is, what's the price of the tennis court? Do you want to be thin? Sure, if you can wave a wand. Oh, but you'll have to have your stomach stapled. Okay, no thanks. Right. So what you need to know is how many people are actually really, all things considered, trying to be thinner. And that is my suggested proxy for how many people, as judged by their own actual preferences, would like to be thinner and would benefit from being pushed in that kind of direction by an increase in tax, regulation, so on. And the answer is not that many. So I think rather than make up the figures, I'll just look at them. Gallup said only 24% said yes to, at this time, are you seriously trying to lose weight? And the NHNES one said 35% said they're trying to lose weight in the preceding year. Also, as a brief mention of distribution, women are trying to lose weight much more than men are. People who are richer are trying to lose weight more than people who are poor are. And people who are more educated are trying to lose weight more than people who are less educated. So what you might infer from this is, if you restricted choices and made people thinner, other things equal, this would be bad for men, poorer people, and the less educated, and relatively good for women, richer, better educated people, and that might have a distributive twist as well. But the point I want to make is this is my claim, okay? So far as we can tell from this kind of evidence, and maybe you can come up with better evidence, it looks like, judged by their own actual preferences, only a minority of people actually are trying to undo the effects of their decisions. They are the only ones for which we have anything like evidence that they would be better off, but judged by their own actual preferences for being thinner. The majority would not. So the conclusion is, if the state tries to restrict options by taxes, regulation, and so on, it is going to make most adults worse off. And that's a good reason not to do it. Maybe not a sufficient reason, but it's a good reason not to do it. That's the conclusion.